Hello, and welcome to the third day and the last day also of the 2021 Science and Technology and Innovation Indicators Conference. Today we are going to have the second keynote by Sarah de Rijcke, and we will also have 4 parallel sessions in the 2 rooms following that. This will include talks about bibliometric indicators, organizational identifiers, scientific communication, and the link between bibliometrics and policy, science policy. But first we will have the keynote, and Professor de Rijcke is the scientific director at CWTS. She is chairing the Science and Evaluation Study Group, and also the co-chair of the Research on Research Institute. And her talk today will be about responsible research assessment, and then I'm looking very much forward to how that is linking to the acid test. So please, Sarah, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to you, and thanks to Jasper also and the entire team at Aarhus. Really appreciate that I can speak here. And thanks also to you who are tuning in. I would love to see your faces, but that will help happen hopefully next time. Yeah, so I'll start by explaining the title. So this actually refers back to a recent heading in one of the editorials in Nature. And what triggered me to think about this title is also one of the questions that are posed here, also in the subheading. So this is actually referring to a situation in which the University of Liverpool figures prominently. And there was a lot of discussion around how the university was planning, and they're actually executing layoffs using certain forms of metrics that our community would consider as misuse of those metrics. But the piece also signals out the responsible research assessment community, and also DORA, for instance, and asks, how should the community respond? So the acid test basically refers to, well, this is a bit of a pun, but I guess the acid tests were a series of parties, but it's also, I'm flagging this here a little bit as a joke, but also to signal that transformation can be difficult, but it can also include creativity, and you also sometimes need an open mind to think about alternatives. But an acid test is also basically a test, a conclusive test to assess the value or the success of something. So this is actually the more serious interpretation, but I'll come back to both of those interpretations of the acid test. So to see how our responsible research assessment experiments in different contexts actually playing out. How should our community maybe also respond and continue to respond, because we're already, of course, very implicated. And also, how can we think creatively, maybe without drugs, but think creatively about alternatives to further this transformation process. So I'll do that by discussing 3 institutions in which research evaluation takes place. So that is, of course, at universities, as we just saw the example of Liverpool, but also funding agencies where a lot of experimentation with more responsible forms of assessment are also occurring, and also the scholarly communication system. So the definition, I guess, of responsible research assessment that I'm using here in this talk is a definition that we developed in the context of a report that we wrote. And we is also here James Wilston and Stephen Curry and Gansen Pelé and my colleague Inge van der Weijden and Anna Hatch from DORA. a report for the Global Research Council on responsible forms of assessment in the context of funding. So we said there, this is an umbrella term for approaches to assessment which incentivize, reflect, and also reward the plural characteristics of high quality research in support of diverse and inclusive research cultures. So that framing is also heavily influenced by framings of responsibility and also care in the RRI community, in which a lot of our colleagues and maybe you present are also working in. So this is familiar, I think, to this audience. I'm putting this on the slide because it signals that there's also a moment in which there's a transformation to not only analyzing problems around research evaluation, but also moving towards solutions and maybe experiments to try things differently. And that sometimes comes from our communities, but it also comes from other stakeholders, including, for instance, the Global Young Academy, the EUA, funders, and other bodies. What we then, I guess, we're also interested in the report, and I think it's a broader concern. So we see these initiatives. We've also written manifestos. We're also collaborating with actors to move this space of responsible research assessment. But also we see that actors in the system respond very differently to the initiatives and also to the larger responsible research assessment agenda. And in that report, we also had a typology of responses. And that's a huge generalization, I guess. But so 4 of those responses are here on the slide. What we refer to as cosmetic appropriation would be that some organizations signal support for the agenda of responsible research assessment, but also they not really take the vital steps of applying and embedding these principles in their policies and also processes. That happens quite often, but also in some contexts that's calibrating the machine. You see that the RRI agenda has been productively applied, but then the steps are relatively incremental, but important. So it's not to disregard that at all. Can openers. So in a number of national initiatives, you see that global initiatives like DORA, but also the Leiden Manifesto, spark reflection and also debate on how more responsible forms of assessment could be adopted. And there, one good example is the work of FOLEX, so the Latin American Forum for Research Assessment. But what I want to discuss is a 4th form, and that is the formation of advocacy coalitions. So you see various alliances and also coalitions for change that respond to this wider RRA agenda, and that explicitly want to develop and also apply more detailed guidance in their own specific contexts. So this is one example of a national level formation of this coalition. And this is in my own country, in the Netherlands. This is the result of a coalition formation of the university associations, but also the association of all the academic medical centers and the 2 major funders in the Netherlands, the NWO and ZonMW. And they want to affect change by also putting together this new framework for assessing and developing and hiring, promoting people, and also work towards concrete implementation at universities and medical centers, at their funding agencies as well. For instance, by diversifying their funding instruments, but also using criteria that facilitate openness and team efforts, etc. And one of the examples that I think are fiercely debated right now are the experiments around more narrative forms of CVs. We'll get to that because there was also an explosion of debate. Some of you may have seen this in their social media accounts. That was over the summer. So at some point, there was coverage of the move by Utrecht University to ban journal impact factors from all their procedures and all their assessment procedures. And that was actually interesting for a number of reasons. For one, all the universities through the VSNU, so the University Association, had already signed up to DORA. But that doesn't, of course, mean that the universities themselves are actually also implementing these types of procedures and leaving out, in this case, the journal impact factor. So there was an explicit statement by the university board that they were actually going to do that. And that triggered a huge debate. And there was concern from parts of the spectrum, large parts from the life sciences, biomedical sciences, and the technical universities that raised concerns about indeed abandoning the impact factor. But their concerns were also a bit broader because they also were making statements about the subjective elements in narrative CVs. And they were saying, okay, it's fine if universities start to broaden their criteria and also start to value more education or outreach activities, but funders really need to keep funding excellent research. And that cannot be done without considering the role of elite journals and journal metrics. And the narrative CVs are absolutely problematic for those reasons as well. So then the question, of course, becomes again, how should the movement for responsible research respond? And here I think I'm also flagging this because for the STI community, there may be different ways in which we engage in these issues. And I was thinking about that in relation to this case, how to classify and categorize the options available in order to also have a response to that question about how do we respond in situations in which push comes to shove. And there's actual movement that we've been wanting to see for a couple of years now and are also working towards. And then what? Then what happens when people start to push back? What do we then do? And I guess there are at least 4 ways to consider options. And one of them would be, of course, to further investigate, to really try to understand and also describe these situations and the problems that are arising. So to really keep an open mind when people push back and to understand where that's coming from, and also to consider the hugely complex ecosystem in which universities, but also, of course, researchers are navigating, the difficulties that institutions have with nuance and also with qualitative information, and the multiplication of evaluation agencies that have happened over the last 5 to 10 years, and that come with all kinds of different types of value systems and criteria and ways of assessing research and researchers. And also the ways in which in the life sciences and the biomedical sciences, for instance, very powerful actors and the entire system have completely internalized impact factor thinking and have adopted that and have it's been inserted in their entire working flow, from the funding to the communication side of things. But also, of course, how platforms come in, how commercial interests come in, how that has become a really contested space as well, and how databases are in and excluding certain things and other things. So that is the part in which we, I think, need to do more research, continue to do more research. But I've also put rehabilitation on this slide, because what I noticed in the Dutch context is that the discussion about the value of metrics has become a very shallow one. And it has for years now been indicator bashing. And for us, I guess, being implicated in that situation for obvious reasons, because we also produce that kind of information ourselves, how can we discuss that with the community, and how can we also maybe educate, train in also the ethics of indicator development and also use, but also maybe also co-create more, despite the fact that it's sometimes uncomfortable to do that at certain levels of analysis. When we talk about individual level careers, can we comfortably design more standardized forms that would help this narrative CV to become more substantiated and more adopted by, for instance, life sciences communities and biomedical communities, because they are very powerful actors in the system, and they have big influence on whether or not these experiments will actually work out. And a lot of work that is going on in the STI community to also think about process indicators, think about open research indicators, and think about how we can make decision-making processes also more open and inclusive, and also thinking about Ismail's work, for instance, also broadening out what can be addressed in a resume, accompanying a funding application. So all these things, I guess, are for me also on this label of co-creation. These are some hands-on examples of my own engagement with these issues, together with colleagues, of course, in the STI communities and also in the more broad, maybe RRA community. The narrative CVs one that was so hotly contested in that Dutch context, of course, it's a larger, more international set of experiments that many funders are currently thinking about or actually already undertaking. And one of the things that we can contribute, I guess, is in the box of investigation and analysis. So how do these experiments work out? What kinds of tensions and frictions do we see, and how can we help resolve those? But also, the being vocal about the misuse of metrics, that is, of course, not new research, but it's something you do sometimes on the basis of a large and already quite established knowledge base and years of STI community engagement, obviously, with these issues. But it's also something that sometimes maybe feels, well, you want to help out and you want to, I guess, really help out and affect change, while also realizing that maybe you don't see the full picture because of what I just said about universities being in a very complex environment and all these different types of evaluative agencies, different types of missions. So you probably don't see the full picture, or you need a lot of time to study and analyze these pictures. So sometimes it's maybe better to do work behind the scenes and not in the form of a letter. And the other, I guess, example of collaborating on designing infrastructures is in the bottom right corner. This is a relatively new project that Dora got funded recently, and that we also collaborate on, and that hopefully results in a dashboard. That's one of the outcomes for universities to make visible their ongoing experiments and also policies and practices around responsible research assessment. And this started, I guess, as thinking about what could be a counter mapping exercise to all the other ways in which universities are ranked and rated, and how can we develop an infrastructure that is doing this differently and flagging more positive perspectives on culture reform and culture change. But it's also really messy and really uncertain how this will, what this will end up in, and hopefully this will work out beautifully. So when the discussion took place in Utrecht and in the Netherlands, and then also internationally on this ban of the impact factor over the summer, I guess what triggered me most was this recurring issue of the biomedical and life sciences communities about global competitiveness, and also the role indicators play in ensuring excellence, and trying to take that very seriously, as I just said, about thinking about this very intricate interwovenness between knowledge creation and thinking with indicators, but also, let's face it, also really the perversities and the tunnel vision and the goal displacement and issues of mental health that this type of assessment also triggers. Plus, of course, the very big question, and this is maybe where the drug-induced acid test might come in when we think about very out-of-the-box type of responsible forms of research assessment. Are we really tackling the most pressing issues by organizing quality control this way? Shouldn't only signal out the life sciences and the biomedical sciences here, of course. Are we ourselves doing that? And are we fostering responsible research assessment to tackle global issues? So that is also what I think is very important, to develop this global view that looks beyond actually how science is organized currently and how it's assessed currently, but also really acknowledge that the system cannot afford any longer to look, for instance, at how countries and fields should approach international competition right now in the current system, because in the coming century we'll be facing a number of very big challenges, which we will urgently need new scientific knowledge for. So I guess the point is indeed not how does quality control work now, but also which science system we need tomorrow for the challenges of tomorrow, and how do we build a sustainable science system for the next generation, and how then can responsible research assessment build or help build that system. And then another, so a third context, I've discussed universities and funders, but a third context in which there's a lot of movement on the responsible research assessment front is scholarly communication. I first want to look at the role of journals in this ecosystem, and I want to thank my colleague Ludo Waldman for thinking through some of the examples, although I, of course, take full responsibility for what I then did with them and how I embedded them in the further analysis in the talk. So you remember RRA, Responsible Research Assessment, is this umbrella term for approaches to assessment which incentivize and reflect and reward the plural characteristics of high quality research in support of diverse and inclusive research cultures. So what role do journals play? How do they operate now? What roles should they play in fostering plurality and this high quality research, and also healthy research cultures? Now, of course, there are several issues with this, and we know that because we live in this system. We also know that because a lot of you are also doing research on this system. And so I've listed only a couple of problems when it comes to quality control on this slide. But yeah, so as you see here, and there's also a lot of activity, of course, by organizations like the Committee on Publication Ethics that have been operating for 20 years now, and also working towards a situation where ethical practices become a normal part of the publishing culture. This is from Nature Comments that we published 2 years ago with Paul Wouters and Cassidy and Vincent and Marie McVeigh, Bernd Pulverer, and also Ludo, in which we listed uses of journals and then the types of functions journal have. So for registering, curating, evaluating, disseminating, and archiving, and I'll focus on the evaluating part, where we say through peer review, works are evaluated according to several criteria, such as quality and novelty, and authors receive feedback from their peers. And through publishing, the journal certifies that the work has been evaluated. The journal continues to perform evaluative functions by issuing corrections and also retractions. Okay, so through publishing, journals certify that the work has been evaluated, and the journal continues to perform evaluative functions after that moment. So I have 2 examples that I think are of interest in reflecting on responsible research assessment in the context of scholarly communication. And the first is about the evaluative functions a journal performs after the work has been published by issuing corrections and retractions. And most of us are, of course, very acutely aware that this is a hotly debated, contested area of concern right now. Some cases bring some quite fundamental questions about quality control to the fore, about hierarchies, also about reputations of journals, board members, and also commercial interests of publishers, questions of academic freedom, adoption of RRA practices in editorial work. Situations that are really rife with, I think, divergent views, conflicting values, fierce disagreements. Does peer review work at all? Does it fail? Should this, for instance, this is only one example, very prominent one, be a correction? Should it be a retraction? What is the status of published research? How do we value the quality control by peers and by editors? How are publishers added to the mix? Do they leave this to the academic community? What do they do when their own brand is at risk of being tarnished? And of course, importantly, there's also this link with the first part of my talk, in which we saw confirmed again, of course, how journal publishing is still what makes and also what can break academic careers. Now, the world of scholarly communication is, of course, undergoing drastic transformations at the moment. So I've put a couple of important developments on the slide, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. So not only are journals themselves transforming, but we also see the rise of other scholarly communication platforms such as preprint servers. And there's a lot of experimentation, again, here as well, with different forms of peer review, from blind to open, for instance, but also experimentation with when review happens, pre or post publication, etc. And these experiments are obviously clearly designed and also implemented to try to find solutions to problems with previous forms of quality control and assessment and review, including bias or intransparency or invisible work of reviewing, for instance. And the COVID pandemic was in itself, or maybe still is in itself, a big experiment in many, many ways, but also when it comes to scholarly communication. So making research findings openly available to all at great speed to benefit, of course, society in an inclusive way, because there's this rapid dissemination and also inclusive because ideally the gap between academics and the general audience is also reduced. But it also raised some really big issues, and this open availability also comes with a trade-off. The downsides are that when findings start to circulate before the academic communities had a chance to carefully review them, that also seems to have actually contributed to the spread of misinformation on pandemic-related issues, and that's a great risk because the stakes are really high. They are political. They are about making evidence-informed decisions. They are about science communication. They are about what's considered academic expertise and the value of that. But also, it's literally also about life or death. So one of the important questions is indeed, as posed here, whose responsibility is it to regulate the use and transparency and dissemination of preprints? We would argue, of course, authors, but of course everyone also realizes that more is needed to put into place proper mechanisms. So my point with that example is also, do we recognize that these discussions are not only technical and are not only about infrastructure or method, but also very much about politics and about power and about unequal access to expertise. And as I said, about the public perception and also faith in scientific expertise. And also, do we consider that responsible research assessment in that context also means that we recognize and that we also discuss the friction that can emerge in the values that we subsume under that heading of responsible assessment, including that openness doesn't always mean, for instance, careful deliberation. So I'm almost done, but I want to leave you with a couple of questions to maybe aid further thought or analysis. If we look at these different review contexts, what does responsible research assessment mean? Questions should, I think, be also addressed about who benefits from particular peer review procedures and who's being served. Who are we investing time in, or what are we investing time in? Who do we give a platform? And do we reflect enough on how notions of quality or high quality shift with the radical changes we see in the scholarly communication landscape? Who benefits from openness and what else might be at stake? And can we find ways together to address the underlying and sometimes conflicting values? So we really, I think, need to understand the context of assessment to better understand also our social role in our community as well. And that's an extremely complicated question because these are extremely intricate issues that we face in this digitized and commercialized information economy, while we also simultaneously move towards more open research on a global scale. So I find it helpful to think or juxtapose forms of values that we might subsume under that responsible heading, the values and norms and practices. So you see here on the left, objective, transparent, and open. Maybe a bit academic, maybe also directing attention a little bit to more technological issues and fixes. And then on the right, you have the more ROI-informed thinking about responsibility, about being inclusive and reflexive and able to respond. D'Ignazio and Klein wrote an excellent book on how power dynamics play out in our data-driven society, including really detailed discussions of attempts to rectify these power dynamics. And I think they make an insightful distinction between data ethics and data justice. So ethics would be fairness, bias, and doesn't challenge power. And data justice would be focusing on equity and maybe instead of fairness, and focusing on reflexivity and also acknowledging historical inequalities and power differences. So last slide, some avenues, I think, for collective action. The cases I've discussed and the types of values that may be at play may actually also be of use very practically to help us also as STI community to consider some forms of action. And maybe we sometimes need a little bit of the drug-induced acid test to find these acceptable. I don't know, but I think it's inspiring to think a little bit out of the box here, and also to help build, for instance, more understandable infrastructures that level the playing field. So thinking about that power and access and equity question, and also help universities to make decisions that recognize and also rectify assessment systems that have led to inequalities. An idea by Lizzie Gadd, I don't know if she's here, but it's one practical example would be to develop a code of practice for responsible research evaluators, and maybe also to develop better criteria for RRA, including how much trust was built between institutions and communities, and how effectively did those with power and resources share their power and resources, how much learning happened in both directions, and how much inspiration was there for future work in a co-creative way. So I'll stop here, and not before saying thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your presentation. This was extremely interesting and also extremely difficult to come up with questions for, because you posed so many great questions yourself, really. But nonetheless, I would like to invite the audience to send in questions, and we will try to relay them to Sarah. We still have almost 10 minutes. And while you're typing, I will try to ask one myself. I appreciated this focus in your talk, Sarah, on developing responsible research assessment infrastructures that is not just focused on excellence and indicators of excellence, such as the journal impact factor. And in your own research, you have also discussed how some of these indicators are actually used to create scientific norms in a field in a sense-making kind of way. But I'm wondering if you yourself have any perhaps more practical recommendations to how we in our field as indicator developers and users can focus more on diverse indicators. Or do you think it's more a question of integrating and communicating about the indicators that we are using that are, beyond journal impact factors and H-index? And if we're looking at more diverse indicators, do you have any suggestions for good avenues to look at? Well, where can we develop these, and what should the aims be?
Thank you. Yeah, when thinking about an answer, I'm thinking about the levels. I think I hinted at maybe the levels for in which we feel comfortable to include maybe certain metrics or indicators, more quantitative indicators, meso and macro level, and slight discomfort, and also I think legitimate concern with individual level bibliometrics. So that's one thing. But I think it would be interesting to start to consider how we could, on all these levels, come up with criteria that are fit for that evaluative purpose, and may also get us out of our comfort zone a little bit. So thinking about process indicators that would facilitate a discussion in the context of a narrative CV around someone's ability to collaborate, and how maybe forms of mobility, openness. Sometimes we probably can't quantify, but we, I think, do have the skills and resources and the expertise to think with communities about what could be considered as hard evidence in the context of narrative CVs, and also about the process of deliberation and decision making, because we are also knowledgeable, I think, as a community about how evaluation contexts can be made more productive, and about deliberation, and about the context in which evaluations occur, political funding, infrastructures. So diversification maybe of the indicators, and also helping to think about the process of evaluating and assessing. And sometimes indeed, as you point out, maybe also integrating, rehabilitating, I guess, and maybe also making aware. I think a lot of the times, at least in my experience, sometimes people are not aware of options that we may think are very obvious options to consider, and that we have at our disposal. One of the things that I find difficult in this space is that we're so implicated. So we also develop them. We also, for instance, of course, in our institution, we also have this company, etc. So it's always a balancing act. But I think because of that expertise, and because of the real, like, being in the clay and in the mud, and really knowing how these issues work out in practice and what the tensions are, we can really have something to contribute, obviously. Hope that helps.
That was a great response. Thank you. There's another question here from Lizzie Gann. Do you have any suggestions as to how we can engage senior leaders to collectively act in the responsible research evaluation space, to see other higher education institutions as collaborators rather than competitors?
Thanks, Lizzie. Great that you're here. Fortunately, I can't see you, but yeah, so I think how we are currently thinking about that in the context of the really large national experiment with the Dutch universities, this will take a bit of time. And I think the question is, indeed, it revolves around leadership and what we consider to be good leadership, and how we how people in leadership roles have been socialized themselves into evaluation systems, and how I think most of the time people have not received any training to talk about more responsible forms of assessment. And I think that is part of the puzzle. I don't know if the question for me is, are we as a community equipped enough to, we need to really collaborate with other people like HR experts or experts in leadership, and combine forces here. But I think that is one of the most promising avenues, but it will take time. So, and also means that we have to reconsider how we hire and promote in academia to also include leadership criteria, and maybe we can contribute there as well. So that would be my first response.
Thank you. We're almost running out of time, but a lot of questions are coming in now. So I'm trying to select something that is perhaps a little shorter. There's a question here from Jon Holm. He agrees that it's essential to distinguish between the different levels, individual, institution, and country, and but how to prevent that these indicators are used on different levels, even though they might be developed or used originally on a sensible level. How do you prevent that from traveling to a more micro level, for instance?
Yeah. I think I have a slight issue. I understand the question, but I think I have a. I think what we try to do here is to understand why it travels to this other level, and to think about why the impact factor matters so much. It's not only about very shallow things. It's also about how the knowledge production process works in these fields, and serious engagement with that kind of indicator to do the work. So I don't think we can start by assuming that there is one good way in which indicators should be used that we've designed, but that we also really have to understand and accept that they also acquire forms of use in practice. So my first attempt would be to better understand those practices before considering questions about prevention.
Thank you. I will let that be the final question, and say thank you once again, Sarah, and thank you all in the audience. And I hope you have a really great last day of the STI conference. Bye.